It is 10 o'clock and we are just about ready to go. We have a lot of people coming in, so I'm going to just hold for a moment while others continue to join. Hopefully you are having a great day, having a great time at SmallSat. So bear with me just a few moments while we have some people coming in and we will be ready to go. I'm also going to set up the Q&A so that you are able to communicate with me. So the numbers are continuing to increase. Let's just give it a moment and I will be right back. For those that are joining, we will begin in just a few minutes. There are more people coming in. So I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes and we'll get started right away. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. For those virtually in Utah, wish we were all in Utah at this time. But I appreciate you joining us for MudLaw's first side meeting at SmallSat. Today, we're going to talk about mitigating space debris. In the United States, that term is more commonly referred to as orbital debris. but for purposes here, you might see me using the names interchangeably. I like space debris, tomato, tomato. But we're going to go through a number of things. And just to kind of give you a background, my name is Charles Mudd. I'm the principal and owner of Mudd Law. We have offices in Chicago, Houston, and Park City. Please feel free to subscribe to our newsletters. There actually is, if you go to space.law, it goes to our firm's webpage, and you should be able to sign up for our space newsletter there. The outline of today's presentation is hitting the background on space debris, orbital debris, talking about the origin of some of the guidelines and rules, looking at the United Nations, the IADC. We'll talk about what were the proposed rules, the final rules now for the FCC. We'll talk about the request for comment that's currently out with respect to the burden on information collection. There also will be a comment period coming up on additional issues that the FCC has asked for further comment and information on. We'll talk about that. I'll go through the process for searching for regulations and filings so that you kind of become familiar with that. Many of you, if you're with any of the government agencies, very well may already know all of that, but for those not, it'll just be kind of a walkthrough. And then I hope that we have a discussion. We are, for a block of period here, a block of time rather. So we're looking at, I think the schedule has us from about 9 Mountain until noon, or 10 to 1 Central. I don't know that we'll go that long. I hope that you stay with me as we work through this. If you have to go, feel free to follow up. And certainly there may be people that are coming in as we go along. We'll see how we go. I will take just some small breaks, not many, but so that you can refill your coffee. I can perhaps refill my coffee, and we can make it through this morning. So what is orbital or space debris? Why care? Well, as we all know, there are varying definitions of space debris, but typically it's a man-made object in orbit around Earth that is no longer functional. Why care? There is a growing problem, as I'll get into shortly, and use some visuals both from NASA and the ESA to demonstrate the concern of the amount of orbital debris and space debris around Earth. And as those numbers increase, the Kessler syndrome is basically, it's a model that there will be a point at which the volume or the number of space debris objects orbiting Earth will create a cascading situation where a collision will create more debris that will create more collisions and will continue to escalate further. So it is a problem. It is something that needs to be addressed. And primarily, we're going to talk today about mitigation. But I'm also going to mention toward the end a little bit about remediation. So mitigation, as you may know, is an effort to try to resolve the issue up front. How do we make sure that we don't increase space debris? Remediation is looking at trying to remove what is already currently involved or might be out there. As one of the commissioners for the FCC stated in her statement to the final rule and order that just came out, the NASA study of large constellations has indicated that if we fail to start deorbiting satellites that have completed their missions within a more reasonable time frame, the likelihood of catastrophic collisions will grow. And we can see here on this chart that the total number of objects in Earth orbit by object type continues to increase significantly. And this is not too surprising when one also looks at additional visuals. Here is an altitude distribution of detected objects. You can see the bulk here is within the 600 to 1,000 kilometer altitude range. The color variation is over here based on the year. So using 2013 figures, you can see a distribution and this very populated area. Though impressive, 2D models, 2D graphs really don't necessarily represent the issue. Let's take a look at a 3D model over time. And where I say courtesy of NASA, I will admit I didn't reach out to communicate directly with NASA on obtaining permission. However, if you do look at the NASA site, they do have information about rights and permissions in use. And so that's where I am obtaining that from. And you can, given the government, you can use their material, particularly for educational purposes, such as we're doing here now. So this is a visual that I want to show across time. I'm going to show a few different visuals to give it a different aspect, to kind of give an understanding of what we're really looking at. Sorry, I just saw a pop-up that I hadn't cleared that said you're muted, and I became concerned that I've been talking to myself for the last 5 minutes. But fortunately, you all, I'm presuming, can hear me, and so we'll continue. So the visuals that I'm showing, before we get into more static words and slides, I want to use these to exhibit the issue of space debris, orbital debris. We oftentimes talk about it in the abstract, and certainly here on Earth when we're walking around, it's hard to think about that, and particularly unless you see the Starlink satellites flying overhead at night, we really don't think about that, or the ISS flowing by, but the ISS is orbiting by, I guess is a better term, by itself. So we really here terrestrially don't get a visualization of the issues with space debris. So this particular video showed over a course of time how the numbers increased from the beginning of the space age until now. Let me get back here. And just give me a second. Oh. All right. Well, that can't you can't get better than having a technical issue on the day that you are presenting. But nonetheless, I hope that you all enjoyed the time there. So, don't know where we were, and I think that you may not have actually had audio to begin with. So I'm going to start. We're going to move along. We're here today to talk about mitigating space debris. Happy to be at SmallSat. I am grateful for you all joining, and let's dive right in. My name is Charles Mudd, principal and owner of Mudd Law. If you would like to subscribe to our newsletters, please send me an email. If you go to space.law, it goes to our website, the firm's website on space law, and I believe right there you are able to subscribe to our space newsletter. We're going to hit a number of issues here. It's blocked off from about 9 a.m. Mountain to noon. I don't know that we'll take the full time. I'm running a little behind now given the technical issues, but we'll see what happens. I might take a little break, 5 minutes, so that you can refresh your coffee, but we're going to try to get through as much material as we can. I'm going to dive into the background, talk about the United Nations, the IADC, the new rules, the request for comment on the burden, paper burden, and then finally I'll walk through regulatory and the filing search and how to submit the comments. And finally, we'll go into discussion. So what is orbital or space debris? The terms are interchangeable, so I might use both. I tend to use space debris, though here in the United States, I feel sometimes out of place if I'm not using orbital debris. Why care? It's a significant issue. As one of the commissioners of the FCC stated not too long ago, a NASA study has indicated that if we fail to start deorbiting satellites that have completed their missions within a more reasonable time frame, the likelihood of catastrophic collisions will grow. And as the previous slide alluded to, the Kessler syndrome is where the number of objects in space increases to a certain extent to where there's an inevitable collision. And then the collisions create more debris, which create more collisions, and what follows is a cascading event. Here in this graphic, we can see the monthly number of objects in Earth orbit by object type. This is credit to Engler, Christoph, and Bayes in their article, Optical Orbital Debris Spotter. You can see the number of objects increasing over time significantly, and it definitely gives a visual of increase. Here we have another 2D model where we're seeing the altitude distribution of detected objects. The red or the maroon 2013 shows that clearly between 600 and 1,000 kilometers is where we're running into the large number, the most populous area. 2D though really doesn't give us the true visual representation of the problem with space debris. And in fact, here terrestrially, when we're walking around, we really don't see those issues. When we look up at the sky, we see the stars, hopefully. Only the stars. We might see an occasional Starlink pass overhead, a few of them. We might see the ISS orbit over our heads, but we really don't see the magnitude of the space debris issue. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the apps that I have does allow an ongoing representation of that to a certain extent, not what I'm about to show you, but Skyview for, I use the iPhone, but sky view will actually show you some of the cataloged rocket bodies and debris that happen to be in space. But again, 3D models, 2D doesn't suffice. When we're walking around in the world, we really don't see the significance of the space debris issue. So this visualization, 3D models, kind of give us a better picture, better representation of what's going on. Here in this one, courtesy of NASA, and when I say courtesy of NASA, I haven't reached out directly to obtain authorization, but their rights and permissions page does allow us to use, particularly for educational purposes, their materials, where we're not branding it as ours and so forth. Here you see the increase in objects orbiting Earth. And it obviously increases dramatically over time. I think this is visually where we dropped off last time, though you didn't have my audio. So we see here the large number of cataloged objects greater than 10 centimeters. Let's look at another fly-through 3D model, again, courtesy of NASA. And imagine our spacecraft navigating through the debris. And when I say spacecraft, oftentimes we talk, here we're talking about satellites, but let's even imagine a manned or with humans in the particular spacecraft going through. And again, these visuals are just to set up the discussion here, to set up our understanding of why there is this issue, why it is something that we really need to be looking at to take care of. As we get to the FCC rules, there were any number of comments that had some objections. Some did not think that they were going far enough. Others thought that they should have gone farther. But I'd be interested to hear your comments throughout on whether you believe that they're just right, whether they are too burdensome or not. And maybe you won't really know until we start talking about them. In any case, this visualization kind of just gives a different perspective on the situation of orbital debris that we have and what we need to take care of to resolve the matter. I'm kind of moving along here so that we can get to the next slide. Now let's look at the orbit across the size of debris in terms of how large the particular debris items happen to be. This is courtesy of ESA. I had hoped that the graphic would be sharper on the large screen, but I hope that it's at least giving you the idea as we go across. And I like this because it shows us the number of items, the objects at different sizes, and it really kind of gives that different perspective of the problem. And as we're talking about that, I'll move on here in just a second to talk about the damage, the concern that there is with respect to space debris, because it's not, again, what's the term that I'm looking for? It's not an amorphous or kind of abstract idea to where we think something may happen that hasn't happened at all. We have had situations where debris has collided with some of our spacecraft, the ISS, the space shuttle. In fact, the space shuttle was impacted by a fleck of paint and had a significant impact. When you consider the velocity, as we all know, the velocity has a tendency to really exacerbate the damage the faster that you're going. And at this orbit speed, you are moving pretty fast. So returning to mere numbers, as I said, small objects can be serious. So the graphic toward the end there where it showed the really small items, that is a concern as well. We're not just talking about the larger objects. Clearly, the larger objects, if they collide, will tend to create more debris, but the smaller pieces are still and can be catastrophic. In fact, looking at this, it's a visualization, not a visualization, a picture of an impact to the Hubble Space Telescope from space debris. So space policy and law, talking about these items and mitigating space debris. From the United Nations perspective, there's UNOOSA, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, and COPUOUS, the Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I have the links there for you below if you wanted to take a screenshot, or later this will be on, I'll put it up on SlideShare. This is the website. You can get to both COPUOUS and UNOOSA through unoosa.org. It has a volume of information relating to space policy and law, so I definitely recommend the site as a good source of information. So let's talk about start getting into the rules. We've kind of seen the visualizations. We recognize, presumably you all agree with me, that there is an issue. And so we will now dive into what the guidelines and rules might be. So 1994, the United Nations Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, the idea for that began. It ended up being a 13-year process that took time, and in 2007 they issued the guidelines. They emerged from the IADC guidelines with consideration of the United Nations treaties and the principles on outer space. As you all may know, there are 5 United Nations space treaties, 4 of which the United States has become signatory to. Space debris or orbital debris is defined as all man-made objects, including fragments and elements in Earth orbit or re-entering the atmosphere that are non-functional. So functional satellites we don't encompass within the space debris or orbital debris definition. And so the prompt, when we talk about this and talk about trying to resolve this, the prompt implementation of appropriate debris mitigation measures is considered a prudent and necessary step toward preserving the outer space environment for future generations. It's similar to objectives in other UN sectors, such as the UN Environment Program, whose mission is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, and enabling nations and peoples to improve the quality of life without compromising that of future generations. So the definition that the UNOOSA picked up with respect to space debris is that also that the IADC uses. So it's a generally considered agreed upon definition of space debris. There are 2 types of mitigating space debris. One is in the short near term, and that's curtailment of mission related debris and breakups. But then the longer term also focuses on end-of-life removal from the operational space. Now, one of the issues in the current, or the rules that have just been issued, is the concern, some people want the 25-year rule to be shorter. The 25-year rule is basically that as a mission or a satellite reaches end of life, it needs to be shown that after 25 years, it will be destroyed or out of the way, moved to a different position and resolved. 25-year period is a long time, and as we get into the mega constellation period, that has raised a number of concerns that 25 years is just too long. Longer term is a focus we'll return to. So mitigation of space guidelines from the UN apply to mission planning, design, manufacture, and operational aspects of the spacecraft and the launch vehicle orbital stages. The guidelines are pretty simple. 1, limit the debris release during normal operations. 2, minimize the potential for breakups during the operational phases. 3, limit the probability of accidental collision in orbit. And 4, avoid the intentional destruction and other harmful activities. Finally, the 5th guideline is to minimize potential for post-mission breakups from stored energy. And a little bit more guidance on that. The most effective mitigation measures have been the passivation of spacecraft and launch vehicle orbital stages at the end of their mission. This requires the removal of all forms of stored energy, including residual propellants and compressed fluids and the discharge of electrical storage devices. So it's ensuring that the stored energy, the fuel, the batteries, and so forth have been discharged, dispersed. But as we'll see with the FCC rules, it's not just releasing liquid into space, because if the liquid released is going to remain in droplet form, those droplets, in fact, become debris items. So we need to make sure that the stored energy is completely depleted. So we have a couple more guidelines on the UN space debris guidelines. Number 6, limit the long-term presence of spacecraft and launch vehicle orbital stages in LEO after the end of their mission. Number 7, limit the long-term interference of spacecraft and launch vehicle orbital stages with the geosynchronous Earth orbit after the end of their mission. So basically, when it's finished, leave in orbit and go above GEO. So if a satellite was in GEO and it's reached end of life, the objective would be to move it above that orbit phase. Question arises though, is that junkyard solution, is that creating a junkyard solution, and is that the best solution to have? The IADC is the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. This is a number of governments coming together. The primary purpose of the IADC is to exchange information on space debris research activities between the member agencies, to facilitate opportunities for cooperation and research, to review the progress of ongoing cooperative activities, and to identify debris mitigation options. The link for their page or its page is below. I do recommend going there. You're not able to get all the material unless you're a member, but there is some material for the public there. There's a steering group, and then there are also 4 working groups focused on measurements, environment and database, protection, and mitigation. Some of the member agencies include, of course, Roscosmos, the UK Space Agency, NASA, the Canadian Space Agency. The main documents are guidelines, the support to guidelines, their statement on large constellations, and a protection manual. All of these, I would say, are key to understanding an effort to address orbital debris, space debris, and even helpful in complying with the FCC rules. Although the IADC states that man-made debris, space debris, poses little risk at the time to ordinary unmanned spacecraft in Earth orbit, this is not universally adopted. And I'd say, since the large constellation statement suggests coming out of the IADC later, the presumptions may need to be reconsidered. I think that it's a dated statement that there's little risk to ordinary unmanned spacecraft in Earth orbit. Regardless, it does emphasize that adoption today of these guidelines and rules will help preserve the space environment for future generations. So each mission program or project should have a space debris mitigation plan that addresses mitigation activities, has as a component the assessment and mitigation of risks related to space debris, including particular standards, measures minimizing hazards with malfunctions that create space debris, addresses the disposal of spacecraft in orbital stages at EOM, end of mission, or end of life, a justification of the choices among possibilities, and a compliance matrix as to the specific guidelines. Common principles coming from these guidelines are to limit the objects released during normal operations. This ties to the UN guideline 1, prevent on-orbit breakups. This ties or parallels UN G2, G4, and G5. These are the guidelines that we just talked about. Remove spacecraft in orbital stages that reached into life from operational orbits and prevent on-orbit collisions. With respect to limiting debris released during normal operations, all spacecraft in orbital stages and all operational regimes should be designed to avoid, or where not possible, to minimize the release of space debris. And no plan should proceed forward unless verification of the effect on orbital environment and the hazard for others is acceptably low in the long term. Now, you may be sitting back and saying, Charles, why are we going through this? This is about the FCC. Well, the UN guidelines and the IADC, of which NASA is a member agency, really kind of fuel some of the development through the FCC. And in fact, the FCC rules and discussion refer back to these guidelines and principles. So they really do help create a package on how to comply with these FCC rules. .2, minimize the potential for on-orbit breakups. And the 5.2, let's focus on the 2. The 5.2 is really referring to where it happened to be in the document, but these are basically the common principles here. I'm going through each of these. So minimize the potential for on-orbit breakups, minimize breakups during the mission, prevent accidental explosion and ruptures at end of mission, end of life, and intentional destruction should not occur. Additionally, with respect to minimize breakups from stored energy, so this again ties into depleting that stored energy, getting rid of all of that so that it becomes safe. There are additional details that we can talk about with respect to specific types of energy, such as residual propellants. Batteries should be adequately designed and manufactured to prevent breakups. High pressure vessels should be vented to a level guaranteeing that no breakups can occur. Self-destruct systems should be designed not to cause unintentional destruction. And power to flywheels and momentum wheels should be terminated during the disposal phase. Other forms of stored energy should be assessed and adequate mitigation measures should be applied. So we obviously don't have the time to dive into every single detail on all that I'm trying to discuss, but there are a lot of resources in these documents that I do recommend for further information that you read. We also need to show under the IADC guidelines that no probable failure leading to an accidental breakups, or where it cannot be excluded, minimize that probability. So ideally, you can show that there's no probable failure of an accidental breakup or failure leading to an accidental breakup. But if you're not able to do that, then at least show that it's been minimized. Monitor activities and plan for contingencies in recovery or passivation periods. Again, avoid intentional destruction. And this is kind of looking to Mission Shakti. Here's another video that I have, courtesy of AGI, or video by AGI. And this shows where India basically launched a satellite destroying missile and destroyed one of its own satellites. And this just shows you the debris field, that a modeling of the debris field that occurred afterwards. I remember being at a conference and looking at AGI's video and then seeing it longer, and how the orbital, the debris field would continue to increase in terms of altitude. And there was a risk, however slight, there was a risk that some of that debris field could have crossed into the ISS orbit. So the destruction of these items, the intentional destruction, is really negligent and should not be done. Post-mission disposal. The spacecraft should be maneuvered far enough away from GEO not to interfere, so that it's above the GEO-protected region. This I call the junkyard solution, pushing it way out. Now, that might be the best solution, because if you, otherwise you're bringing it down into lower orbits, and that is not necessarily a good thing either. And because you're crossing through those other orbits and creating a potential risk of collision. But nonetheless, that's what here this principle is discussing. The propulsion should be designed not to be separated from the spacecraft, but remember, elimination of stored energy. If it does need to be separated, that is the propulsion system, it needs to orbit outside the area and designed for passivation itself. So this is additional details that the IADC provides, with the minimum increase in perigee altitude and an eccentricity less than or equal to 3 1,000ths, 0.003. So there are details, more details within the IADC guidelines. With respect to the LEO region, it needs to be deorbited or maneuvered into orbit with a 25-year or less lifetime. At 25 years, end of mission, end of life, lifetime, not, it doesn't include the actual mission period. And you need to show, ideally, that there's a 90% success for disposal. Retrieval, of course, is also an option. The ESA, the European Space Agency, had talked about deorbit, and now has Clear Space 1 designed for 2025 as a projected time frame where they intend to go and actually retrieve their own space debris, because we need to remember property rights in space do exist. We can't just go out and collect the property that belongs to somebody else. There is a classic case in terms of maritime law where there was a shipwreck not too far off a shore, but it had been there for years and years and years. Somebody went out there to try to recapture the ship and obtain the property on it and so forth. And the owner said, hey, wait a second, that's my shipwreck. So just because it's defunct does not mean ownership rights have gone away. And in fact, the ownership rights remain with, and the liability for that object remain with the launching state, meaning the launching country. And so anybody that were to perhaps interfere with that object might shift or create a different situation where they assume liability. Anyway, debris that is intended to re-enter the atmosphere does not pose an undue risk to people or property. So limit the debris or have it in uninhabited regions. Hazardous materials should be prevented or minimized to avoid pollution, and large constellations may need a lower residual orbital lifespan or a higher degree of success in making sure that they are resolved. So the IADC guidelines also talk about and show where certain objects or where spacecraft can move and go to. So region A on the graph that I'm about to show is for low Earth orbit, and that extends, as you may know, from the Earth's surface up to about 2,000 kilometers. region B, geosynchronous protected region, has a range of the lower altitude is the geostationary altitude minus 200 kilometers, where the upper altitude is the geostationary altitude plus. So it's plus or minus 200 kilometers from the geostationary altitude. We can see that visual here. And so the reason for this visual in the guidelines is talking about particular protected regions that we want to ensure or mitigate space debris. Other orbits, spacecraft or orbital stages that are terminated or terminating their operational phases in other orbital regions should be maneuvered to reduce their orbital lifetime commensurate with LEO lifetime limitations, or relocated if they cause interference with highly utilized orbit regions. And that goes again to our junkyard situation above GEO. To prevent on-orbit collisions, we need to estimate and mitigate the accidental collisions with known objects during the orbital lifetime, and the design should limit the probability of collision with small debris that could cause loss of control and inevitably post-mission disposal. Here, and you'll see, bear with me, you'll see the genesis of some of the FCC rules, but the point that I want to make here with respect to design is that it really, implementing and compliance with the FCC rules really should begin at the design phase, because then your designers, your engineers are going to help collaborate and be able to help articulate the narrative that complies with the FCC rules on describing the certain requirements. Finally, avoidance maneuvers for spacecraft and coordination of launch windows may be considered if reliable orbital data is available for situations where collision risk is not negligible. The IADC also issued a statement on large constellations in 2017. It does plan to update. At the outset, the statement recognized the development's question the validity of the assumptions underlying the guidelines. Remember before where I indicated that the IADC guidelines started off, well, it's not much of a risk. They are indicating that with the large constellations, some of those assumptions may be questioned. The robustness of the guidelines may not be there to manage new constellations, meaning that they need to be redefined, and adequacy of reliability of disposal functions are also called into question. The statement, the presumption outdated, is anticipated. Most proposed concepts in operation altitudes above 1,000 kilometers. Now, here, what I mean by that is that a lot of the large constellations, and I believe SpaceX with Starlink, some of the original proposals for the large constellations have been talking about having the satellites at altitudes above 1,000 kilometers. However, that has changed, and some of them have modified or amended their guidelines, or amended their orbiting intent, the altitude, to lower than 1,000 kilometers. And so the presumption on the IA statement is of that altitude is already outdated. With new decisions to employ or lower operational altitudes in the average space traffic in LEO, this should cause pause. So with the satellite companies deciding now to lower their orbit, this should create additional concern. That being said, the change to lower altitude mitigates a causal eternal lifespan. So in other words, by moving to a lower altitude, while it certainly may be in a more congested area and create more concern on one hand, they're also indicating that it also eliminates the possibility that it's so high and might need to be almost eternal in its orbit, meaning that we can deorbit them or have burn up. So it's interpreted as technical guidance on how best to comply with the guidelines. For a constellation C design, consider sufficient altitude separation between all parts of the constellation and other constellations. consider a higher probability of success of post-mission disposal. So from 90%, let's say, for a specific satellite to 99%, maybe, we'll see. Altitude separations at intersections between the orbital planes of the constellation significant enough to avoid interplane conjunctions. The design of the spacecraft should be sufficient for onboard redundancy of its all functions in post-mission disposal, monitoring function for post-mission disposal capability, and minimize explosions and include collision avoidance. These are ideas and statements or guidelines with respect to large constellations. Also, the spacecraft design should have controlled reentry and options that reduce the number of size of harmful fragments that might hit the ground, improve likelihood of success for post-mission disposal, and high overall spacecraft reliability to minimize accidental explosions. Enhance the trackability and provide information on planned trajectories prior to performing orbit transfer maneuvers. With respect to operations, the same strict adherence to upper stages as to the spacecraft, operational collision avoidance, and maneuver plans timely communicated to the relevant actors. Although a 25-year plan is better than some other options, shortening the post-mission disposal timeline would be ideal, and maintaining collision avoidance capability during the post-mission. They also suggest that we need to monitor on a regular basis post-mission disposal function and initiate disposal function should reliability ever drop to critical levels, even if the design lifetime spelling error, my fault, is not reached. So we need to, and if there's an issue where the disposal function or there's a failure, we need to just end it, do it now to avoid loss of control at a later time. Use intermediate lower injection altitude. Perform initial tests at a region without direct consequence for the space environment. So test the vehicle before it gets into a more significant area before and getting to operational altitude. All right, for those that are still with me, we are diving into the FCC updated rules. So I want to go very quickly through what we have here, and that's a background. How do we get, so we have the United Nations guidelines, we have the IADC. How did the FCC get to where it is now? Let's start at the beginning. In 1995, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued an interagency report on orbital debris. It recommended a study on the debris, emerging LEO, and possible mitigation measures. And NASA and DoD directed NASA and the Department of Defense to develop draft design guidelines for the government and industry, which they did. In 1997, the guidelines from NASA and the Department of Defense focus on controlled debris released during normal operations, minimizing debris generated by accidental explosion, selection of safe flight profile and operational configuration, and address post-mission disposal of space structures. You see the parallel, how those principles are following along from the UN, the IADC. In 1997, as I said, the NASA and the Department of Defense issued their guidelines. For government space missions, the guidelines would apply. And for the Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, it was directed or suggested that they adopt or propose rules to apply them to commercial operations. In 1999, the FCC sought comment with respect to 2 gigahertz band with respect to those kind of space debris, orbital debris items. The FCC decided in 2000 to continue on a case-by-case basis, based primarily on comments from the Department of Defense in response to the FCC seeking comment in 99, having concerns about adopting the wholesale guidelines to the commercial sector. But it did require the 2 gigahertz MSS parties to submit a narrative statement describing any debris mitigation design and operational strategies. In 2001, the FCC proposed to apply this further to a different class and indicated an intent to propose the filing requirements for all FCC licensed satellite services including orbital debris mitigation issues, safe flight profiles, and operational configurations, as well as post-mission disposal practice. So it starts to talk about how it's going to apply these rules across the board. 2002, the FCC reported that the few comments responding to the proposed application of disclosure requirements supported them being applicable to all satellite services. So it required the NGSO FSS applicants to disclose the orbital debris mitigation plans before licensing, and for any re-entry of the spacecraft on post-mission disposal, address casualty risk assessments as well. And it directed people to review the US government orbital debris mitigation standard practices. Here's a link for that. In 2002, the FCC also issued in the matter of mitigation of orbital debris, and this is the genesis then of the current version of the rules, 2002. The FCC combined, in 2003, it combined two different dockets, but adopted as part of the default service rules a requirement to submit a narrative on design and operational strategies used to mitigate the orbital debris, and a casualty risk assessment for any re-entry of spacecraft for classes in which no service-specific rules were adopted. So if the FCC had already adopted specific rules for a particular service class, then those service class rules would apply. If there weren't specific rules, then the general would be there. Referred parties to the US government's orbital debris mitigation standard practices and the IADC debris mitigation guidelines that we've just gone through. Other issues from orbital debris notice and extending disclosure requirements from future commission activity. 2004, the second report and order came out. 2018, so that was the 2004 was the report, the initial then order of guideline, the rules, and then 2018 was the first time in 14 years that they had been looked at and proposed to be modified. 2020, April 24th, they issued the debris mitigation rules that are currently out there, and they didn't adopt all of what they had been talking about. Some they delegated for further proposed rulemaking, and right now, July 13th, the OMB is seeking comments on information collection burdens with respect to those rules. So that deadline for submitting comments is September 11th. But I want to make a distinction here that comment period is on the information collection. That comment period is not on the additional issues that were noted for further proposed rulemaking in the April 24th rules. That has not, those that have actually not been published in the Federal Register, and so that the clock hasn't started ticking. Before we begin, or rather before you begin compliance, you'll need to obtain software through which you can calculate the probabilities. It needs to be an equivalent or just use NASA debris assessment software. The link for that is provided below. And again, I do recommend that you take a look at the United States Government Orbital Debris and Mitigation Standard Practices, the 2019 update, and also NASA procedural requirements for limiting orbital debris. So the FCC updated the rules in 47 CFR 5, 25, and 97. 5 applies to experimental radio service, 97 applies to amateur radio service, and 25 satellite communications. I'm going to focus on satellite communications at SmallSat. Nonetheless, a lot of the rules for experimental radio service and amateur radio service there are similarities there. And somebody posted a comment that I did just clarify, is that the comment period that's currently out on the rules is on the information collection burden of those rules. It's not actually on the additional proposed rules that they're seeking that they've issued for further proposed rulemaking. And the reason for that is, and in fact, the effective date, as I say below here, the effective date for any of this has not started yet, or the calculation for that has not started, because although the rules have been published by the FCC, they haven't yet appeared in the Federal Register. And until they appear in the Federal Register, the calculation for both the comment period on the further proposed rulemaking and the effective date for some of the terms don't start. So as soon as that is published in the Federal Register, that date will start. I've seen before it's a kind of, it could even be a 3-month period. We're kind of at that, but with COVID-19 and delays, I'm not sure when it will appear in the Federal Register. With respect to the effective date of the actual, so let's take a step back. In the FCC updated rules, the document that was issued April 24th, there are 2 sections primarily. Let's divide the rules out into the rules that become effective that have been decided, and then there are also additional rules that have been proposed and or seeking additional comment. The additional comment, again, that timing, that period has not yet begun. As far as the rules that have been decided, those have 2 different effective dates. As I say here below, for section 25.271D and 282, it's 30 days after the publication in the Federal Register, which has not yet occurred. The effective date of the other rules are at the conclusion of the comment and so forth with respect to the OMB on the information gathering burdens. So stay tuned for specific dates on that. And with respect to 271, it's very short amendment of controlled transmitting stations. 25.282, the space station operator will coordinate on an operator-to-operator basis with any potentially affected satellite networks. So those are the 2 that effective dates occur 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. The others are going to follow the comment period and then the results of the OMB information collection. So with respect to the actual rules, the FCC updated rules, a description of the design and operational strategy. So the satellite, in complying with these rules, a satellite operator or somebody applying for a license is going to have to provide a description of the design and operational strategies that will be used to mitigate orbital debris, including the following information. And we're going to go through this information now. It's somewhat dense. I'm not going to read everything, but I did want to go through it, and I'm going to be selective in the portions that I address. Again, I'm not going to get into the experimental radio service or amateur radio service. I'm going to focus on the satellite communications, and even then try to summarize. Some of the text it's a mesh between quoted right from the rules and my paraphrasing. So let's proceed forward. So 25.114D, you're going to need to provide a statement that the space station operators assessed and limited the amount of debris released in a planned maneuver during normal operations. You're also going to need a statement indicating whether the space station operator has assessed and limited the probability that the space station will become a source of debris by collision with small debris or meteoroids. And that needs to be at a 1% or less probability. Again, it references the NASA debris assessment software or a higher fidelity assessment tool. So any of the calculations on the probability, you're going to need to use that software or something with a higher fidelity. Statement that the space station operator has assessed and limited the probability during and after completion of mission operations of accidental explosions or the release of liquids that will persist in droplet form, which I mentioned earlier. This includes a demonstration that the debris generation will not result from the conversion of energy sources on board the spacecraft into energy that fragments the spacecraft. You're going to need to address whether the stored energy will be removed at the spacecraft's end of life. A statement that the space station operator has assessed and limited the probability of the space stations becoming a source of debris by collisions with large debris or other operational space stations. Where we're talking about NGSO, you're going to also need to provide additional information such as this, that you've assessed and limited the probability of collision between any space station of the system and other large objects 10 centimeters or larger during the total orbital lifetime to less than 1 in 1,000. You're going to need to describe the characteristics of the space station's orbits that may present a collision risk, including any planned or operational space stations in those orbits, and what steps, if any, have been taken to coordinate with the other spacecraft or system, or what other measures you may use to avoid the collision. Let's take a pause here really quick because, again, so much of this goes into knowing the design of the spacecraft. So if you're in the process right now of designing spacecraft or a satellite, you want to know what these rules are. You want to be paying attention so that you can start developing that, having your engineers aware of this so that it's built into the modeling. That will also help comply with the rules by having the narrative to explain all of these statements. Reading on, if at any time during the space station's mission or deorbit phase, the space stations will transit through orbits used by any inhabitable spacecraft, the statement must describe the design and operational strategies that will be used to minimize the risk of collision during that phase. Statement would disclose the accuracy, if any, with which orbital parameters will be maintained, including the apogee, perigee, and inclination and right ascension of the ascending nodes. You must certify that upon receipt of a space situational awareness conjunction warning, you will review and take all possible steps to assess the collision risk and will mitigate the collision risk if necessary. As appropriate, steps to assess and mitigate the collision risk should include, but are not limited to, contacting the operator of any active spacecraft involved in such a warning, sharing ephemeris data and other appropriate operational information with any such operator, and modifying the space station attitude and/or operations. This is a key one that applies across, and you almost need the plan set up for this kind of a situation, a procedure manual. Where a satellite operator is requesting geostationary orbit, you need to also include an assessment of whether there are any known satellites located at or reasonably expected to be located at the requested location, or assigned in the vicinity of that location, such that the station keeping volumes of the respective satellites might overlap or touch. If that is going to occur, the statement must include you must include a statement as to the identities of those satellites and the measures that will be taken to avoid collisions. A statement addressing the trackability of the space stations. Again, where we're talking about NGSO, additional requirements exist to identify, you need to, how you plan to identify the object, your spacecraft, whether active or passive tracking will occur whether you're going to register or whether it is registered with the 18th Space Control Squadron or the equivalent, and to the extent to which initial deployment ephemeris and or planned maneuvers information will be shared. This is one on which a number of people commented that they were concerned about sharing the information and so forth, and that there would be a reluctance to share information. And in some of the discussion, the FCC responded, as I recollect, that others had commented that that really wouldn't be an issue, and so I'm not thinking that it is. And that information obviously will help mitigate space debris and avoid collisions. You also need a statement disclosing planned proximity operations and addressing the debris generation that will or may result from those proposed operations. You should discuss any planned release of debris, the risk of accidental explosions, the risk of accidental collision, and measures taken to mitigate the risks. And when you're working with your engineers, when you're working with your logistics and doing testing, you want to make sure that the testing is designed into the parameters at issue here in the rules are designed into that testing. I can't emphasize that enough. This all has to start from the design stage to really make your process going to be that much easier or streamlined. You also need to have a statement detailing the disposal plans for the space station, including the quantity of fuel, if any, that will be reserved for disposal maneuvers. In addition, you need to provide for geostationary orbit space stations a disclosure on the altitude selected for disposal orbit, and the calculations used in deriving that altitude. For space stations terminating operations in an orbit in or passing through LEO region below 2,000 kilometers, the statement must disclose whether the spacecraft will be disposed of through atmospheric reentry, specifying if it's a direct retrieval of the spacecraft. You should also disclose the expected time in orbit for the space station following completion of the mission. Again, this is that 25-year period or less. For stations not covered by either A or B, you must indicate whether the disposal will involve use of a storage orbit or long-term atmospheric reentry and the rationale for selecting that disposal plan. For both of those, though, for both B and C in this particular rule, the statement must include a demonstration that the probability of success of the chosen disposal method will be 0.09 or 0.9 or greater for any individual space station. That's a 90% probability of success. And here's where we're talking about the larger constellations. For space station systems consisting of multiple space stations, the demonstration should include additional information regarding efforts to achieve a higher probability of success, with the goal for large systems of a probability of success for any individual space station at 99% or better. That's key. So we're going from a 90% probability of success for the disposal method on a single space station to a 99% probability of success for each individual space station where it's part of a larger system. Successful disposal is defined as atmospheric reentry of the spacecraft within 25 years or less following completion of the mission. For space stations under C, successful disposal will be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you are going to use the atmospheric reentry, you need to indicate whether the reentry will be an uncontrolled reentry or a controlled target reentry, and an assessment as to whether portions of any individual spacecraft will survive atmospheric reentry and impact the surface of the Earth with a kinetic energy in excess of 15 joules, and demonstrate that the calculated casualty risk for an individual spacecraft using the software, NASA software, a higher fidelity is less than 1 in 10,000. Makes sense, right? If you're only doing remotes, here are some exceptions. If you're doing remote sensing only, if you show that you've given this information to NOAA, that's fine. You need to certify and show that that information has already been provided to NOAA. If it's a non-US licensed system, you can show that if you can show that it's subject to direct and effective regulatory authority by national licensing authorities. So if you're subject to a licensing authority in your nation, your home country, then that can be an exception. License terms and renewals in section 25.121, I'm not going to get into. 25.122 talks about streamlined small space stations. And here the burden is slightly less, as is consistent with the rules that came out recently, excuse me, for streamlined small space stations. But nonetheless, they parallel a lot of what we've just talked about. The space stations will operate only in non-geostationary orbit. This is what you're going to have to show. You're going to have to provide in the statement that the space stations will operate only in non-geostationary orbit, have a total in-orbit lifetime of 6 years or less, be deployed at an orbital altitude of 600 kilometers or below, or maintain a propulsion system and have the ability to make collision avoidance and deorbit maneuvers using that propulsion, be identifiable by a unique signal-based telemetry marker, release no operational debris, that you've assessed and limited the probability of accidental explosions, including those resulting from the conversion of energy sources on board the space stations into energy that fragments the spacecraft. Again, this reflects one of the other requirements we just read. The probability of a collision between each space station and any larger object, 10 centimeters or larger, is 1/1000th. Will be disposed of post-mission through atmospheric reentry. The probability of human casualty from portions of the spacecraft surviving reentry and reaching the surface of the Earth is 0, as calculated from using current NASA software or higher fidelity models. Again, that is, as you may remember, just before we said 1 in 10,000 here. But for the streamlined small space station, it has to be 0. Operation of the space stations will be compatible with existing operations in the authorized frequency bands. Commanded by commands originating from the ground to immediately cease transmissions, and the licensee will have the capability to eliminate harmful interference when required. Be 10 centimeters or larger in the smallest dimension and have a mass of 100 kilograms or less, including any propellant that's used. It also must be showing that it has a probability of becoming a source, of debris by collision with small debris or meteoroids at 1 in 100, so 1% or less. And again, here the same requirement on when it's receiving an SSA conjunction warning that we talked about previously. So I'm going to skip past that. We also need to show an overall description of the system facilities, operations, and services, and an explanation of how uplink frequency bands would be connected to downlink frequency bands, public interest considerations in support of the grant, and a description of the means by which the requested spectrum could be shared with both current and future operators. So some of these, like right here, are not so much debris mitigation, but part of the streamlined small space station rules and requirements. If at any time during the space station's mission or deorbit phase, it will transit through the orbits used by an inhabitable spacecraft, It needs to show a description of the design, the operational strategies, if any, that will be used to minimize the risk of collision and avoid posing any operational constraints to the inhabitable spacecraft. A statement identifying the characteristics of the space station orbits that may present a collision risk, including any planned or operational space stations in those orbits, and indicating what steps, if any, have been taken to coordinate with the other spacecraft or system, or what other measures the licensing plans use and avoid collision. Again, these two reflect what we've talked about before with the general satellite rules. So I appear to have locked up again. Hopefully not. Just a moment. I'm not sure what is going on here with the PowerPoint. So what I am going to do is, if you can hear me, bear with me. I'm going to be right back if I can figure out how to take care of this issue and proceed forward. We're nearing the end though, and we're going to talk about, just to finish up, a few more rules, and then I'm going to talk about how you can go and easily find all this information and go through it. We'll talk about the comments. So maybe this is a good time if you hear me just for a few minute break, and I will be right back. So I'm back. I do not know why I'm having the technical issues today with my computer. I'll have to talk with my MacBook Pro after the webinar. We'll have a good conversation, trying to throw some jest in here for a moment. So we're moving on, and hope you've had a time to grab your coffee, and I appreciate you staying with me. It's always, when you see the numbers and you see the numbers of participants vary, it's hard not to take it personally. So I appreciate, for every one of you that's still listening, that's still here, I appreciate it. Thank you for staying with me despite the technical issues. So for Streamlined Small Space Station, the FCC updated rules, that's where we were. We talked about these two here, how they reflect some of the rules for the regular satellite operations. We also need a statement disclosing how the licensee or the operator plans to identify space stations following deployment and whether the space tracking will be active or passive. This reflects, again, another term that we had just talked about. So I'm going to move right past it, but it's the same term for the Streamlined Small Space Stations. A description of the design and operation of maneuverability and deorbit systems, a description of the anticipated evolution over time of the orbit of the proposed satellite or satellites. If there are any planned proximity operations, a statement disclosing those planned operations and addressing debris generation that will or may result from those proposed operations. These two reflect those that were from before, but it's making sure that they're applicable here. A demonstration that the probability of success is 0.9 or greater, 90% or greater for any individual space station. Space stations deployed to, that's the probability of success at disposal. Space stations deployed to orbits in which atmospheric drag will, in the event of a failure, limit the lifetime of the space station to 25 years, do not need to provide this additional demonstration. A list of the FCC file numbers or call signs for any known applications or commission grants related to the proposed operations also needs to be provided. We talked about the SSA conjunction warning. And so that is the new rules that, again, the effective date is not yet determined on those. Those are the new rules that will come into place that will be effective at a date not yet determined because we're waiting for them to be published in the Federal Register. Once they're published in the Federal Register, some of those regulations that we talked about, those two small ones, will be effective 30 days later. The remaining number of those will be effective after this, where we're talking right here regarding comments on the information collection burden. The comment due date is September 11th, 2020 on the information collection burden. And for here, the rules show that, or the instructions, any comments are to be emailed to Kathy Williams at the FCC. They seek comments on the information collection burden. In that context, the FCC recognizes, while that new information sought represents an overall increase in the burden, it does serve the public interest, and it's appropriate for the public to have the necessary information about the satellite applicants' plans for mitigation of orbital debris. So we've really come a long way from when we first started talking about orbital debris, since our country first started talking about orbital debris, to doing it on a case-by-case basis, asking for mitigation information or discussion, and now these rules. It is a burden, but we need it. It's part of the public interest. So in this comment period right now, again, this comment period is not on the other proposed rules that they're seeking comment. This is on for what has already been decided in the information collection burden. So whether they're looking for information on whether the proposed collection of information is necessary for the proper performance of the functions of the commission including whether the information shall have practical utility, the accuracy of the Commission's burden estimate, ways to enhance the quality, utility, and clarity of the information collected, ways to minimize the burden of the collection of information on the respondents, including the use of automated collection techniques or other forms of information technology. So, for example, might there be a way that they can set up automated questions to get the information? And ways to further reduce the information collection burden on small business concerns with fewer than 25 employees. However, the general thought is right now that it doesn't necessarily impose that much more of a burden on small business concerns with fewer than 25 employees than anyone else. So where do you find regulations and where do you submit comments? For the FCC, I'm going to direct you, and they would direct you, I believe, to fcc.gov/ECFS, Electronic Comment Filing System, as opposed to beta.regulations.gov. You can find things at beta.regulations.gov, and I'll show you in a moment, but I typically start with the ECFS for two reasons that you'll see. One is, for the FCC, you're going to have to oftentimes submit comments through the ECFS and not through regulations.gov anyway, so better to start there. So here is a visual of FCC's electronic comment filing system. You can see here it has search for filings, search for proceedings, search full text. I want to focus up here. You can also submit a filing, check filing status. So if we go to here where we're going to put something in, such as orbital debris, it comes up with a list of documents that are responsive to that. We can over here select how we want to sort, descending, ascending by date, and other choices. So if we selected descending, and we see the International Bureau, which is from where these are coming, we can collect, this is hovering over the particular document, and so you can click on the individual document, or and you'll see the date there that it was posted April 24th. So we see that this is the most recent document, April 24th. So if and there was a question asked, where will the recording be available? The recording will be available. There is a link actually through our Zoom, but I imagine that this recording is going to be a large space. So it will also be up on our YouTube page. If you go to youtube.mudlaw.com, later today or tomorrow, it will be uploaded there. So youtube.mudlaw.com. Thank you for the question. So we can select the individual document, or if we click, let's say, International Bureau as the heading right here, or this is the one that we're wanting, then we're going to come up here and it lists the individual documents off to the side. We can also hyperlink connect to these documents. You also want to look at the proceeding number 18-313. 18 is the year. So even though this was posted on April 24th, it is the proceeding that started in 2018 with the original notice of proposed rulemaking. So here is the document. As we click it, this comes up, and we can go through the different documents, the different statements of the commissioners. So again, in that context, we can go and search for these particular documents by typing in whatever search term, or with the 18-313, we get to then submit a filing. We can put that in here. Once we start typing the 18-313, mitigation of orbital debris in the new space age comes up. We recognize that that's the one that we want. We can go further to if this was actually seeking a document to which we are filing right now. This is the full field of all the different information, and you can upload a document. This is through the FCC's ECFS system. Let's take a look at regulations.gov, beta.regulations.gov, just for a moment to compare. So we type in the same term, orbital debris. Documents come up. They are sorted by best match initially. I changed that to newer to older. Comments due, newer to older. Here we can see that. So what I am wanting to show you here, though, is on the Federal Communications Commission, a document, let's just say any document where the comments are due. This is the particular collection activity one for the current document, for the one that we've been talking about all day. So you'll see comments should be submitted on or before September 11th, and it will tell you where to submit the comments here. So again, this is the notice of the collection of information burden that they're seeking, the FCC. Focus there on where to submit the comments. But just in contrast, what do some of the other agencies allow through regulations.gov is we could choose, let's say, comments that are due in the next 3 days. Different agencies come up. The FCC is there, Customs and Border Protection. This is a completely different document. It's not the one that we're talking about right now. And let's just take a look at this elimination of customs broker district permit fee. You can actually do that, select it, and type in the comment if you wanted to right here. So beta.regulations.gov for many agencies makes it very efficient to submit comments. You could also upload a document there, but you could, if somebody just wanted to type something, they could do it very easily. Searching beta.regulations.gov, we can actually go down here on the bottom left and choose the agency that we're wanting to see documents from. And you see, if we look at these from the FCC, the comment instructions are in the document. And we saw one earlier where it said to email the comments. And if we look at this one down here, it talks about right at the bottom, comments may be filed using the Commission's electronic comment filing system. So that's why I go back to the FCC ECFS. But you can get to either place, but eventually to submit the comments, usually it's for FCC, it's either by email or through the ECFS system. So though the burden will likely to continue to be justified in the context of public interest, I do recommend that you work through the required items and identify any concerns rather than mere comment. In short, test the new rules, see how much of a burden there will be, see how you're able to do that. And remember that additional items will come open for comment shortly. Although each satellite project and mission may be unique, we will be developing a narrative skeletal outline that encompasses all the required items as well as those proposed. Let me know if you'd like to be kept up to date on this endeavor. Remember, on the FCC seeking comments on information collection burden that's due September 11th, we probably intend to be filing a comment. This is not on the proposed rules that are still up for discussion. And in fact, going to what Commissioner Rosenworcel indicated, she would have liked the rules to tighten the 25-year rule of after end of life before it's disposed, talking more about deorbiting end-of-life satellites and addressing more of the collision risks for large constellations. So in the next comment period, I encourage you to participate And these issues are going to be metrics regarding the probability of accidental explosions during and after completion of satellite mission operations. Some have objected to this because it diverges from NASA's, or they allege that it diverges from NASA's metric and creates a higher threshold for acceptable collision risk. Also, another one is how the commission will assess probability of collision with large objects and casualty risk on a system-wide basis. Applicant certification that NGSO space stations can perform collision avoidance maneuvers during any period above 400 kilometers. Some have objected because this could prevent many small satellite operators from obtaining a license. They're also going to look more at the indemnification of the United States against claims brought under the Outer Space Treaty or the Liability Convention. Some have objected already to the costs that would impose to indemnify the United States. And then finally, for purposes here, discussion, adopting the bond requirement tied to successful disposal of the spacecraft. And that is a significant bond depending on the satellite and the particular mission operation. So those are some of the things that the FCC is going to seek further comment on. That notice that comment period has not yet begun. Again, it'll start when the Federal Register publishes the April 24th document. Are there other issues that you're thinking about? There is a survey when you leave. Please feel free to identify issues in there. We will try to address them, or we will collect them and maybe have another webinar to follow. Next steps, I encourage all of you to actively engage in the discussions and the debate. This is designed to create a better space policy, a better space environment for the future and future generations. And the only way that we can do that is if we all actively engage. Push technology to improve situations. Let's develop the better technologies now. And in fact, let's develop new technologies that we can utilize to move from, to stay with mitigation, but also to adapt and do remediation. Again, that refers back to ESA's older ED orbit and now Clear Space 1. Again, there's an ownership issue in collecting, remediating or collecting debris out there. It is still owned by somebody. So ESA's Clear Space 1 is going to try to recapture one of its own space stations, satellites. It's scheduled for 2025. We'll keep up to date on that. There's information about with the ESA project, some of the high-ranking hotspot regions to that might be more practical to go after collecting older items that are end of life. Active removal can be efficient, particularly in these target areas, because the target items to be removed are high mass, there's high collision probabilities, and high altitudes make it very efficient in certain regions to go after this. This is just a visual from ESA, kind of showing what their goal is. If we continue and we don't do anything, there's one vision of what the debris field looks around Earth. But if we do take implementation of mitigation and remediation efforts, there's a significant possibility that we can reduce that over time. Another issue, and there is a question on what is the best place to continue to engage in the conversation. I'll get to that in just a moment. One other issue that is of importance to me is the light pollution or the reflected light off of satellites. We've seen with Starlink the sunlight reflected off of the solar panels, the satellite, and so forth. SpaceX has really taken a great effort to work with the astronomical community. They've developed newer technologies such as the DarkSat and the VisorSat to try to address those concerns. They are continuing to work on that. SatCon 1 the AAS and NSF hosted SatCon 1, and there are presentations online about that. Not the video presentations, but the PowerPoints showing the effects, the adverse effects on science. SatCon 2 talking about the policy and so forth should be coming up. I wrote to these issues, and I really do, or wrote about these issues. I think that the orbital space is part of the Earth's environment, and we need to look at it that way. So here are just 3 principles that I've identified that I think that the United Nations Environment Assembly should adopt in recognizing that aspect. They've come close to recognizing light pollution as an environmental issue. I think that the light, the reflected light from the orbital environment is as well. I'm not gonna, that's a side topic, so I'm not gonna dive into that further right now. I'm open for discussion. I know that many of you have stayed along. I appreciate that. If you have any questions, let me know. There is a question here, as I said, on where is the best place to continue engage in the conversation. That's a really good question. And I believe 1, through the comment period, 2, but that is directly with the agency and submitting those and trying to get more involved in the dynamics and so forth. I think there are other areas. The United Nations, the UNOOSA office has done some capacity building. They used to, I don't know if they're going to have this year. The last 2 years, 2018, 2019, they had conferences on space law and policy, talking about a wide number of issues related to space. And that was open. You could apply to participate in that. There are other opportunities such as conversations online. If you email me, I will make a point to put up on our site, coming back to some of those sources, because that is a really good question. And I wish that I had more information on that right now, since I was talking about engaging. Here are some final links and resources. I want to thank you all for staying with me and participating. I also want to thank my team, particularly BJ, Jordan, and Jacob, for some of the supportive work in developing the presentation. My contact information is there, and happy to address any other questions that you may have. But it's been, I understand how sometimes these webinars take long and presentations, and it's a lot of information. We've been going on, despite the technical issues, for nearly 2 hours now, so it's been quite a while. What I intend to do, just talking about engagement and so forth, what I intend to do following this, the video that's being recorded will be posted on our YouTube page. youtube.mudlaw.com will take you directly to the YouTube page. What I also will do is transform the old smallsat.mudlaw.com to having links to resources. We are developing a page on our website for additional resources that will be coming up in time. And then also we have a space newsletter that, you know, my wife said, I don't like the email newsletters and so forth. It's not going to necessarily be something that comes out every week, or certainly not every day, maybe not even every month, but it will be a source to come out when new items happen, such as knowing when the comment period starts or knowing certain deadlines and such. That will be in there so that it will try to provide information as it comes along. Again, the recording, somebody had asked before, I just said it, but I want to repeat again. The recording of this will be available on YouTube. And seeing no other questions, I really encourage you to complete the survey. It helps give me information afterwards. I hope that you've enjoyed the material. I know that sometimes it can be dry, but for those of us that are interested in space and technology, I find it fascinating. I want to be involved, and I'd love to hear more from you. So with that, I'm done. there are no more questions. There might be a couple chats here, so I just want to check before I turn it off. And thank you to those thanking me. All the best. Stay healthy and safe. I wish that we were talking in person and I could come up and shake your hand in Utah, maybe next year. There are a couple other conferences, of course. SpaceCom is going to be virtual this year. We will be at SpaceCom. I believe that we will have a virtual booth, so please feel free to come by and chat. But in the meantime, communicate with me. I'm open to that. Thanks so much. I'm signing off and have a great day.